by creating these subsidized insurance schemes, Florida and California are creating the possibility of a doom moment where all of a sudden, all of these properties that are nominally worth hundreds of thousands of dollars aren't worth anything, like are unsellable.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I'm Murray, in charge of podcasting, and in charge of politics is Robert Morse. How are you, Robert?
Well, I'm marvelous today, Rory, because it's a nice, cool day in August.
Okay.
It's in the high 60s, low 70s in New York City. This is actually the first cool day we've had this entire summer in New York City. So I've decided that climate change is a myth.
Well, that's good to know, because I was thinking of getting away from here because of all the riots, and I was either going to move to Miami, San Francisco, or New York. Do you think they're good choices?
All great choices, because climate change is a myth. This is it's a cold day in August, Rory, so there's nothing to worry about. I mean, despite the fact that in all of July, there was a single day in New York City that was pleasant, like that you actually wanted to be outside. I've decided, I was really concerned about climate change because of that, Rory, but because there's a single kind of cold day, everything's fine. We're all good. Nothing to worry about.
Well, I'm just happy that the Saudi royal family can keep on ticking over and nothing will threaten.
Just keep drill, baby, drill. We're all fine. It'll be great. It'll be great.
Is it possible that it may not be great?
I think yes, and that is what we'll be talking about today. I think I'm kind of, I wouldn't say I'm famous for anything, but I traditionally don't talk about climate much. I don't talk about, but I think just experiencing summer in New York City over the past month and a half, I'm finally giving up in mid-August. I'm like, you know what, screw it. I'm just going to northern Michigan. But experiencing July in New York and comparing that with July in the New York City area in my youth, I'm not joking. There was one decent day in July for like outdoor activities. Every single other day was or maybe there were two. It was just unpleasantly hot and the sun was torturous and you wanted to get away from it. That is not the way it was when I grew up. So perhaps inspired by that, I picked up a book called On the Move by Abrahm Lustgarten, a New York Times and ProPublica journalist who consolidated a lot of stuff about climate migration. And I think it would be interesting to talk about that topic more generally today and to talk about this book in particular.
Also might be pro-Michigan propaganda, this book.
Yes, I really did appreciate the sort of key messages from this book is that you might be okay if you live in a sort of privileged area. Well, I live in Harlem, which is not traditionally the most privileged part of New York City, but New York City as a whole is among the wealthiest and most privileged places on the planet. So despite its very real climate vulnerabilities, I can probably rely on some wealthy people figuring out a seawall or something.
But in short, it is Mexican border bad, Canadian border good.
Yes. So that's the first message is be somewhere with rich people, and the second message is go to the Midwest, which is great because I spent a lot of time in Michigan.
Does he focus specifically on America? Because all the interviews I've seen with him, that's all they talked about, or does he talk about the rest of the world too?
So he does go to Guatemala. There's some moving reporting from there. Guatemala, Central America more generally, is sort of generally reckoned to be experiencing some pretty horrific results of climate change, driving a lot of migration. But it's mostly U.S. focused, and that's intentional. I think he wants to just drill down on what is this like? How is climate migration, how are climate impacts going to change the United States? And it's a fantastic read. It's something that I've been looking for a while, which is just sort of consolidating the science, consolidating the predictions, talking a little bit more seriously about like what the variables are. And he does all of that in this book while also keeping things interesting. There's enough narrative journalism here. There's enough talking to people. There's enough describing people who are already in pretty horrific situations, crucially not just in Guatemala, but also in the United States. talking about people in coastal Louisiana who are already experiencing very serious climate effects that are turning them into climate migrants, talking about his own personal experience as somebody living in his version of California paradise, the threat of fire, not just, the threat to his house proper, but the fact that it seems like now multiple days out of the year, he and his family can't actually live normally in California.
Well, that's the thing that struck me is I thought it'd be more globally focused, and I thought it'd be more based around like a sea level rise. But it seems to be mostly America, and forest fires are going to be significantly worse in the future.
And also, it's not just that. It's talking about how it's going to be a lot harder to live in just a lot of places in the country, just the way it was hard for me to live in New York City in July. You just don't want to go outside anymore. And this is what drove the migration, the incredible migration we've seen in the United States over the past 100 years out of the Northeast into the South, was people I just didn't want to do another winter. But as more and more of these places become entirely unlivable during the summer and creeping into the spring and fall, I think it's very likely, I think to some extent it's already happening, that we're seeing some of this migration.
And also there seemed to be an emphasis on crops that grow well in Southern America. So things like corn and soy in Texas might just become impossible and then just move up. Different types of, well, basically if you're in a climate that can't grow grapes for wine in America, the chances are in the future you will be.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, does he touch on desertification?
Because, absolutely.
Because the region of Mexico that borders America is quite deserty. So my assumption would be just basically that whole lower half of America becomes a lot more inhospitable.
Well, the strange thing, and I think so I guess we'll get into quibbles with this book.
Okay.
Is that I think he focuses on agriculture a lot. He talks a lot about that sort of thing. But I think there's a kind of helplessness in the way that he writes that honestly could come quite legitimately from looking at this
Colossus heading towards us. Because there seems to be a lot of 2099. So this is a proper, what's that, 80 years in the future?
Well, I mean, some of it's happening right now is what he emphasizes. But I think because he's looked at this problem so much more closely than I have for decades at this point, and seen us just do absolutely nothing and actually figure out really convoluted ways to avoid looking at what's happening. He's very negative. But a lot of the stuff in agriculture, it's been a long-standing complaint of mine that, I read science fiction that talks about, well, nobody's going to want to live in Arizona anymore, and they're going to stop people at the California border. They're not going to let people from Arizona come in because we'll run out of water. And it's like, actually, no. The Colorado River is a tremendously important political issue in the Western United States. You could argue even the central political issue in the United States. It is the water source for a number of Western states. It has never provided as much water as it's supposed to. It is a real concern, and it's that concern that leads to this sort of sci-fi dystopia image of everyone's going to have to leave Arizona, that honestly, even in a nonfiction book, this guy indulges in to a greater extent than I think makes any sense. The fact is, and I think this is very true and really not acknowledged, is that certain kinds, if not most kinds of agriculture in California and Arizona are going to not be viable a couple decades from now.
It does seem to be California's definitely in for a rough ride, according to this.
But the thing is, they're not. California agriculture is. Arizona agriculture should not exist. Clearly. And that's sort of the thing, is that other books that I've read on these issues acknowledge that this book doesn't really acknowledge, is that nobody should have been far from Arizona and California in the first place. Like, there's a famous surveyor in the 19th century who went to see the whole West, and he was like, well, of course, this is always going to be a tourist wasteland. There's nothing that, you couldn't possibly have large populations or do agriculture here because it's all a baking desert. Mm-hmm. Through heroic government efforts across the late 19th and especially, early 20th century FDR era, we created essentially life on Mars.
And air conditioning.
Yeah, well, air conditioning, of course. but just the viability of California agriculture, the fact that, and it's true that California is an agricultural colossus that provides most of the produce that the country consumes. There's no like geographical or environmental reason for that, other than that the U.S. government, in part during the Great Depression, wanted to make a lot of jobs, so they built a bunch of dams to create this entirely illusory thing. California and Arizona agriculture are simply not long-term viable. I mean, maybe certain kinds are, but this whole we're going to do a semi-truck full of water to grow each and every single one of your almonds thing isn't viable. That does not mean that Los Angeles and Phoenix are going to dry up and blow away. The vast majority of the people who live in Los Angeles and Phoenix and San Francisco and San Diego have nothing to do with agriculture. They love the freshness of I was just talking with a friend from California about how much she loves the produce because of this amazing Imperial Valley agricultural complex that probably won't be there in 20 years. But you know what? Los Angeles is still going to be there, and it's going to be bigger.
Does he talk about Las Vegas at all? Because from what I understand, Nevada got a very raw deal with that river. So it means that they have taken, water conservation very seriously, and they have things like, no, you shouldn't have lawns with grass in it because you have to water them. You just have to have stones and cactuses. Is there a talk of basically more states and cities just taking water more seriously and copying Las Vegas?
Well, so what needs to happen, and I think the kind of the hopelessness of Abrahm Lustgarten, who's been the author of this book, who has been looking at this issue for decades, in what I like to call the Reagan era, in the sort of business over everything, property rights over everything era, it makes sense. There's a lot that you can look at and say, good God, like the current United States, pro-business fundamentalism, property rights fundamentalism context is not going to be able to handle any of this. And I think that's his position, and I think that makes a lot of sense. The California-Arizona agriculture problem is that under settled, I think it's state law mostly, but maybe some federal law as well, these agricultural folks, and I think Nevada might have a raw deal, California has the best deal. I couldn't speak to how it all works, but a bunch of California farmers have like very privileged, very serious rights to all of this California water. And what simply needs to happen is the California laws need to change. The millions of people that live in California cities have to be like, yeah, I'm sorry, the 25 guys that benefit from the large agricultural corporation that's using literally 70% of the water are no longer going to be privileged over the tens of millions that are using 30% of the water. Like, I'm not sure if those are exactly what the percentages are, but they are that lopsided. So in a world where we say have the people with the ability to get things done of like, say, a Richard Nixon or a Lyndon B. Johnson, very few of the problems he describes in this book are actual problems. They're problems, but they are problems that are so solvable with like basic tricks like, we're just not going to give infinite, amazing, forever property rights to the Colorado River to like 15 agricultural businesses. We're just not going to do that anymore. It just doesn't make sense. And we're gonna come up with whatever legislative or legal solution that allows the vast majority of the people in the West to actually use the water. What would really surprise me is just like there is a final chapter in this book on the Midwest. And according to all of the models that he's got, I don't know how reliable these models are, the Midwest is going to be great. It's actually going to be, people are going to want to come back there in droves. The winters are going to get easier. The Midwest has always been an agricultural breadbasket, but when all the specialized expensive stuff that California is doing has to move, it's going to move to the Midwest. It's going to be a population zone. And he was just like, gee whiz, I don't know if any of these cities are going to be able to build the buildings necessary to house these people. And I'm just like the United States is in a long-standing inability to build anything. And if that continues, then yes, it's a legitimate question. But I do think that, look at what's happened to Austin. Look at what has happened to Florida and Texas over the past. People came in absurd numbers, and they were housed. I think I don't think it's that crazy to expect Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin to be able to house people, especially because they've got excess housing stock already.
Are you seeing any like massive catastrophes, like a giant forest fire that may cause, 500,000 refugees suddenly rocking up more north, expecting to be housed?
Well, the screwed up thing really is we've already got those. Like I was reading this book and I was like, you know what, like. Yeah, I get, like, why he's so panicked about all this stuff. There was the horrific, I think it was 2020. Would you have heard of this? The Camp Fire, the town of Paradise in California. It was international news. It was essentially a flourishing town of 20,000 that was completely wiped away, burnt up. And I think, 80 people were killed. The entire city was burned to the ground. The thing was, though, about that is that, so I was like, it doesn't seem like, I haven't heard anything about wildfires this year. And I can remember in recent years, California wildfires have burnt so much that they've actually blocked out the sun in New York on the other side of North America.
That's terrifying.
And I was like, wow, I haven't, we haven't done any of that since there's none of that this year. And then I Googled it and it was like, no, actually, this is one of the worst wildfire years we've ever had. It just isn't affecting, I'm not getting an orange day in New York or something along those lines. So it's
another horrible thing is it could just be not in the news cycle. It's like, oh, that's so last year.
Well, it's basically people have gotten used to it. It's now just part of the furniture. And actually, 2024 is a horrifically bad wildfire year. But what's interesting about the Paradise Fire and about the author, Abrahm Lustgarten himself, is that he kind of, I think he acknowledges that he is kind of this person now, but he is kind of, by choosing to live where he lives in California, he's making the same bad decisions of the much more easily mockable people who go out and rebuild their house for the 15th time on that reef in Florida, after it's been knocked down by the hurricane multiple times. Like, again, like, I don't want to, I think this guy is a little too negative, but the situation that he's describing is a real problem that we absolutely must do more about. But this is a guy who's chosen to live out in the woods in California.
Well, that's the thing. He does seem a bit hypocritical because he was talking to some climate expert and he basically said where he lived, and the climate expert was like, oh yeah, sell immediately. That's a terrible place to live.
Yeah.
Because I think the other horrible thing is it feels like when you're selling shares, you want to sell them when the market still thinks everything's good because you don't want to wait till the bad day. So it's like, now might be a good time to move north because your house will still be worth something. And then there's a whole thing of there might get to a point where you can't insure your house and then the price drops. And then once more people, the price drops. And then at a point where you just can't give your house away. So there is a bit of a, not necessarily fear-mongering, but it's like, you really should sell your house and move north now, but he hasn't.
Yeah. One of the great, that insurance issue we're talking about was one of the great things in this book, just sort of walking through the details of that. We're at a point where insurers no longer want to insure certain Florida and California properties because of hurricane and fire damage.
Florida is the flattest state in America, very swampy and very low to the sea, so it will be the most badly hit by sea level rise.
Yes, and it's already being hit by sea level rise. And there's people who talk about, and not necessarily in this book, how it's already impacting Miami real estate, where the sort of higher land, even though it may not be as...
it's Florida high, which isn't high enough.
Well, no, but even though the higher land, which used to be more poorer neighborhoods because it's further back from the beautiful beaches, is now becoming more desirable.
Well, because it's nice seafront.
Not quite there yet.
But
getting there. And so insurance companies stopped wanting to pay. So Florida basically stepped in. The Florida state government was like, well, we're going to start insuring more stuff so people could buy insurance on their houses. California has now started doing the same for a bunch of wildfire vulnerable properties. And it is absurd that they are doing that, because it is essentially saying, oh, this is risky. We all acknowledge this. There have already been disasters that make it pretty true. Let's now put the state on the hook for
Who was
this.
the general that was like trying to fight the tide or the waves? Was there like a Roman general that was like...
King Canute.
It reminds me of that. You're like, yes, we're going to beat the tides. We know this is coming. And it's like, no, you're going to lose. Just to give a little bit of context, it's believed that we could have a 7-foot sea rise by the end of the century, which would mean basically all of the coastline for about good 10 miles of Florida is underwater, and maybe about 20% of the southern part of Florida is underwater. So that would be a realistic, because quite often sea level rise, people go mad and go, let's do 60 feet. And you're like, so 7 foot seems to be a realistic thing. And yeah, a lot of Florida is going to be under the sea.
That seems to be very likely. It is interesting because I think a lot of people are sort of dialing back their predictions of climate apocalypse, but the consensus seems to be that Florida is just a bad bet, especially all the places in Florida that people actually want to live. And what's fascinating is that Florida itself has tried and failed to back off of its own insurance subsidy program. They started doing this in the aftermath of, I want to say, Hurricane Andrew, like back in the 90s. They started subsidizing insurance, and then they got to a point where they had an accountant that was like, wait a second, if we get a bad hurricane season, Florida is going to run out of money. The United States federal government can do deficit spending, until the cows come home. We have a large national debt. States have to balance their books. And if there's a bad hurricane season, then all of a sudden, Florida not only runs out of money, has to do a massive tax increase. Then they also stop being able to insure going forward, which means that swaths of Florida property immediately can no longer get insurance. And if you can't get insurance, you can't get somebody to buy your house with a mortgage, which basically means that by creating these subsidized insurance schemes, Florida and California are creating the possibility of a doom moment where all of a sudden, all of these properties that are nominally worth hundreds of thousands of dollars aren't worth anything, are unsellable. So Florida tried to dial back. Sorry?
You know the H-bomber guy meme with Ben Shapiro?
Say, for the sake of argument, that all of the water levels around the world rise by let's say 5 feet over the next 100 years, say 10 feet by the next 100 years. And it puts all the low-lying areas on the coast underwater, right? Which, let's say all of that happens. You think that people aren't going to just sell their homes and move?
Just one small problem. Sell their houses to who, Ben? King Aquaman?
Yeah, no, that's exactly. And that is a case, that is where we're kind of at.
One of the stats, just to give you a little bit of fear from the book, he doesn't give a timeline for the one I'm seeing, is 500,000 Americans could endure bi-weekly flooding before the end of their contract 30-year mortgage. Bi-weekly flooding, that's terrifying.
Yeah, but of course, it's only 500,000. And the thing about the predictions made in this book is it's not... He's just so negative and does not believe that the United States is capable of basic adaptation that the United States is already doing.
But is it possible sometimes once there's the energy's taken out of a city, is it possible there's a point where just people don't want to go to New York anymore? They want to go to Detroit. I know at the moment it sounds humorous, but it could be just Detroit's just where it's at and New York's a has been. Once it loses the impetus and all the rich people leave, it could quickly fall apart.
Well, that is a very interesting risk that he brings up. These sort of everything's fine. You continue, so you find somebody to buy your property, or you think you'll be able to find somebody to buy your property, and then boom, all at once, the state's insurance scheme collapses. You have an unsellable property, and you're stuck. And that's a real risk. That's a real thing that people are thinking about, and that's why Florida is actually trying to cut down on its subsidization of insurance rates. And then, of course, Ron DeSantis piled back in to do it again because Republicans are stupid. What's that?
Is there any talk of the Dust Bowl? Because when I think of ecological disasters that have happened in America, the Dust Bowl springs to mind. Is there any...
Of course.
Does he mention that and use that as an example? America went through this and it learned X from it, and we could implement something like that?
So the Dust Bowl is famously, I think, centered on Oklahoma, but also including other western states. Essentially, a whole bunch of European farmers rushed in there in the 1880s and the 1890s and used a bunch of entirely inappropriate agricultural practices that destroyed the land. And then there were also, whatever climactic effects were in the 1920s. And then essentially the Dust Bowl, there's these really moving, even before the Great Depression, these really moving pictures of just swaths of Western America that are just have desert-style sandstorms where people used to have what they thought were flourishing farms. And yeah, I think that is an example he brings up. But I think what happened during the Dust Bowl is, that was certainly exacerbated by the fact that the Dust Bowl starting in the 1920s, and then you had the Great Depression in the 1930s. But by the 1940s, and I would hope that it would be a faster process than in 20 years, all of those Okies, as they were called in California, were absorbed, wherever they had moved to. And what was kind of surprising to me is, and I think just wrong, is that he describes the Great Migration in, I guess, the 1890s through the 1930s, or maybe even in the 1940s, that took place, the migration of African Americans from the South to the North. He describes that as the largest migration in U.S. history. And that was only 6 million people. And this is another characteristic of this book, which I don't actually fault him for, because the truth is, and one of the great messages of this book is that we just don't know.
No.
We don't know how bad it could be. But I think the estimate is that between 13 million and 100 million people could be climate refugees in the United States by the end of the century. And he's like, and the 13 million, the low end of this estimate, is twice as big as the Great Migration of African Americans from South to North. And that is just nonsense, that the Great Migration of African Americans it may be the biggest migration that we talk about in the history classes, but the migration of Americans in the course of 4 decades to California is vastly larger than the Great Migration. To Texas, even to Florida today, over the past 2 decades of this century, we're talking about more people moving to Florida than the entire multi-decade Great Migration. So yeah, it just that one thing that actually just struck me as I was preparing for this kind of bugged me. That's just so flagrantly wrong. And what else is so flagrantly wrong in this book? If he was talking about the Great Migration as the biggest migration the United States has ever experienced. I feel like I'm coming across as too negative about this book. I think it is a really valuable consolidation of information and approaches and stories and possibilities. But it didn't really say anything that definitive. One thing that it did signpost that I think is tremendously important is the way that specifically in the South, definitely in Louisiana, a lot of poorer, vulnerable populations are getting hit incredibly hard. Louisiana actually, I think, is losing vastly more coastline than Florida is at this point. It's very low rising. It's got a Mississippi that often floods. Louisiana is disappearing, and we're already in a situation where incredibly vulnerable Native American and African American populations are losing their villages. In some cases, towns, communities that were founded in the aftermath of the abolition of slavery. They go to marginal, low-lying lands where freed slaves could actually build communities and farming, and now it's being inundated, and they're being dispersed and then forced out. And there's some great description in this book of innovative ways to handle that, like actually uprooting whole communities all at once so that they move a couple 100 miles inland and get to live in the same neighborhoods, that kind of thing.
This is something America has the option to do, because I think California City is, you can see it's all like the roads and all are laid out, but people haven't moved in yet. So America definitely has the room to just go, look, we'll plan this city, and as people slowly move, they can build up the city, which is something like other countries, like particularly Ireland, don't have. Like if things go wrong, there just isn't room to go anywhere else.
Well, that's a really key point here, and I think gets to what I'm talking about, and I think why I'm a little more optimistic than Lustgarten here is, like, I see things as changing. I see the kind of planning that you're talking about there as becoming more and more plausible, more and more possible. Just being like, hey, like, you can't live in low-hanging Louisiana anymore. Let's build a neighborhood in Baton Rouge, you know? Just doing that level of planning, which frankly, at this point, is utterly impossible. The way that zoning regulations work in the United States, the way that housing politics work. But I think it is changing. And I think that true climate catastrophes, which we will see more of, like I think New Orleans will flood again. Maybe New Orleans is a much less viable city than we've been, fooling ourselves that it is since 2005. There will be more disasters. There will be wide groups of people. I believe this is to be the case, but I think that we have the money, we have the know-how, and we have, as you pointed out, the space to handle all of that. Even if the worst prognostications in this book come true, if there's 100 million people, if all of Florida has to empty out, and most of California and Arizona dries up, we've got the space. We can absolutely handle it. We've got the money and we've got the resources. And if you look at these people as an economic asset, which I think a lot of mayors in the Midwest are doing, you're actually like, oh, well, this just means that Michigan and Wisconsin get to be California and Texas again.
Can this be good news for Canada? Because I've heard, complaints that Canada's very welcoming to migrants, but even that won't sort of save its economy. Will this mean there'll just be a lot of Americans that want to move to Canada because it'll just be so much more hospitable than a lot of America?
Maybe. Canada's a weird place, man. Have you ever heard of a couple times. Have you ever heard of the Canadian Shield?
No.
It's this weird geological formation that makes a lot of Canada kind of useless. You look at the population graphs of Canada, and it's kind of fascinating. There's just something like, I don't know what it is exactly, but something like 70% of the population of Canada is like across a Great Lake from Buffalo. Like, it's just, they all live in this little sliver.
Well, because of the way I think of it, you have that straight line of the Canadian-American border, and then it's like if you just continued that, all of the Canadian population live below it.
Yes, exactly. And there's certainly, it's cold up there. There's the proximity to what used to be a much more dynamic economic environment in the Midwest and New York in the United States. But also, the population gets a lot more dispersed as you go out west in Alberta province and British Columbia, because you can actually do viable farming there. But there's this Canadian Shield, this weird rocky outcropping that basically meant that north of Toronto and then all the way to Winnipeg, you just can't have any kind of viable agriculture there. It's just this very strange. So this sort of idea of everyone just sort of moving north from there, it actually wouldn't be. Maybe Alberta and British Columbia would be doing better.
Well, because that's definitely a region that can take a larger population.
Exactly. Well, the thing is, like, everywhere in the United States could take a lot. I mean, New Jersey is famously, I think, the densest state in the United States, and there are vast swaths of like nature in New Jersey. There's plenty of space in the United States.
One of the just a wee snippets from the book is basically saying that very few people in the year 2000 experienced 130 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 55 Celsius. But by 2025, that nearly 6 million Americans could be experiencing such weather. So that's
by
Death Valley
year?
weather. No, 2050.
2050, no. Well, Arizona's already pretty bad. We've had these weird heat dome experiences. Oregon is actually a pretty cool, well-watered state north of California. But in recent years, they've had these really hideous weather events where just all of a sudden, in surprisingly localized areas, they're going up to 110 degrees.
Terrifying.
And your rooftops are melting and you can't do the light rail and like stuff like that. And I mean, there's no question climate change is happening. Climate change is going to be real bad. We just don't know how bad.
Sadly, don't a lot of the models, they find out they were underestimating and things are sort of getting worse at a faster rate than previously thought?
But that's the thing, is it's constantly changing. Like he actually mentions in this book, I can't remember what the acronym is, but there's these, I almost wonder if sometimes these climate modelers make it more difficult than they have to be, because there's a lingo. There's like a scenario 8.5 or something like that, which is the basis of all the scariest the scariest predictions. And the consensus that everyone was talking about a couple of years back was, actually, it looks like we're not going to get the 4 degrees of warming in that scenario. It's not going to be that bad. We're going to have very bad catastrophic effects, but like society will survive. Now, this year, the approach, perhaps because people are paying a lot less attention to climate, the approach is actually things are much, much worse than we expected, and it oscillates back and forth. And I think that is a somewhat depressing lesson from this book, is that I really wanted to read a book where I got a little more clarity on like, where are these predictions really, And this is a very celebrated science writer. I mean, he's not a scientist, but he's a writer on this. He's talked to a lot of the scientists, a lot of the consultants. And even, at the end of this book, it's like he has no idea. And nor does anybody else. So, yeah, I mean, sure, you can, and that's the thing about climate, is you can absolutely find support for both. Oh, things are getting much, much worse, much more quickly than we expected, and then actually maybe the worst, and those can both be true. Things are getting worse, much more quickly than we expected, but actually the more catastrophic possibilities seem like they're not happening. And so, yeah.
Is there any talk of migration from Central and South America to the United States?
In the book, absolutely. He goes to Guatemala and attempts to follow the journeys of a few people. And it's tremendously depressing. And it's also an indicator, and I think he talks about quite cogently in the book, just like the Guatemalan government is essentially useless. There was a very moving passage of there's a whole family that made a decision that they simply had to move. They had no choice but to deal with coyotes. One of the sons dies. It's all very sad. But basically, if the Guatemalan government had put it together to contribute like an $800 piece of irrigation equipment, that family and the entire village could have stayed. And I think that's a great testament of this book, is just the value in a climate-oriented, in a climate catastrophe scenario, the value of having A, money, resources, which the United States absolutely has, and B, governmental capacity and willingness to do things. And that is something that, well, the jury's very much out in the United States. We don't know.
But is it saying that a lot of the developing world doesn't have this capacity and is going to massively suffer?
He doesn't really come out and talk, with the exception of that description of that failure in Guatemala. He doesn't talk so much about governing capacity. I think probably in part because he's trying to put together a book that appeals to everybody. But I would imagine if you actually talk to the guy, it's just the whole past 40 years of Reaganite, if it's not a market-based solution, it's not a solution approach. I can't imagine that he's anything other than outraged by it. He does talk briefly, I guess it was pretty new, probably when this was being published, about the Inflation Reduction Act, which is largely described as one of the largest environmental pieces of legislation in the world in human history. But the jury's very much out. He just doesn't know what the reactions to that are going to be.
Because from what I understand, places that have quite extreme weather already are just going to have significantly more extreme weather, and it'll just get worse for them. Deserts getting bigger, cyclones getting bigger, forest fires getting more common. Is there any hope in the book?
Is there any hope in the book?
Other than
yes.
Book your flights to Canada?
Yeah, well, he talks a lot about the Midwest, but he's not that hopeful about the Midwest. It's interesting because I think his models sort of dictated. He worked with a consultancy called the Rhodium Group, I think, for a lot of the models underlying his work here. And the Rhodium Group is, I guess, pretty bullish on the Midwest. It really is it is the United States. If you truly believe, which I am a bit dubious about, considering the wide availability of desalination technologies, if you truly believe that the world is about to enter a water crisis catastrophe, then once again, the United States, what's the famous, probably not, quote attributed to Bismarck, God looks after fools, drunks in the United States of America. So if you truly believe that we are going into this water crisis, Mad Max environment, the United States has the Great Lakes, which are I think by far the largest source of fresh water on the planet. And the Midwest, we already have, because those lakes were so useful for earlier industrialization processes, we have a ring of cities around those lakes that have a lot of spare capacity. So that is he somewhat grudgingly in his final chapter talks about that as a kind of an answer to all of the U.S.'s problems. And at every level of plausible catastrophe, that Midwest looks like a tremendous resource to the United States that is going to be potentially where a whole bunch of Americans live where they didn't before.
Does he talk about any countries in particular that are going to get hard hit? Like, does he mention China or anything?
Does he mention China? So it's not really his focus. His focus is specifically the United States, which I respect as a choice. He just sort of wanted to...
He did do one on... He has written a book on China, didn't he? About, Tibet and China building more railways and stuff.
Yeah, I was interested to read about that, but I haven't looked into it.
And then also the Deepwater Horizon as well. So he seems to have more of an environmental spin on things.
For sure. But the focus of this book is specifically on the United States. And we are famously solipsistic in the United States. We love to hear about ourselves. So that's probably a good marketing choice on his part.
So cynically, do you think he's working with any particular organizations to promote the buying of land in the north of America?
I didn't get that vibe.
Oh, you didn't get that
Californian. He's a Californian. He's mostly...
but he might have to move to Washington State.
True enough. He's talking down his own biggest investment, which is, I assume, very pricey property in California.
Uninhabitable zones he's talking about. So some more doomsaying is in the year 2020, 1% of the world's land was too hot to live in, essentially. By 2070, it'll be 19%. So I'm just terrified by, I know we're mostly focusing on America this episode, but I think this is really bad news for Europe.
Oh, it's incredible bad news for Europe. There's recent information saying that, possibly by the 2060s, I'm not sure if it's the Gulf Stream. No, I think it's a Atlantic tide system that brings a lot of warm weather to Europe. So actually climate change could result in, certainly Ireland and most of Northern Europe being kind of uninhabitable in a new ice age. Because
that's an old one that they've talked about for a long time. And I think it's often used to discredit scientists. It's like, I don't know, it's one theory that's unlikely to happen. It seems the likes of Ireland will just become more like semi-tropical, just like you'll have one or two incredibly warm days and then a lot of torrential rain. But what I mean is I feel like there'll be a lot more like refugee migration into, Europe, because it's not going to be good for Africa.
You remember that film Children of Men?
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen it?
No. I know of it.
So it's a Clive Owen film from, probably 2005. I don't know, something like that. And it's about a dark future where most of the rest of the world has fallen apart, but the United Kingdom still has some political stability. Also, because of declining fertility, essentially. People stop being able to have children. So someone had tweeted about this recently, but I've actually had this experience. I remember watching it in the 2000s and being like, oh man, what a great, dark sci-fi future. That's amazing. And then sort of watching it in 2015 in Turkey on a rooftop by Galata Tower and being like, oh, Jesus, there's a lot of footage of refugees in cages. And you're like, oh, this is a really grim future. And now it just looks like, what's actually happening. And nobody wants to watch it anymore because it seems like reality now.
It's too real.
Yeah. But as far as the concrete predictions, it's just, and he's honest about it. It's just nobody knows. Nobody knows. What I see as the central question of this book, I don't know if consciously or unconsciously, is sort of, can the United States handle climate change or not? We have all of the resources, all of the space, all of the capacity we would need to handle even the most extreme versions of climate migration he's describing in this book. I get the sense that he doesn't think we can handle it.
Okay.
I think we can. I think that absolutely there's going to be injustice. Absolutely there's going to be great suffering as there already is. There are already people moving out of Louisiana. There are already people moving out of Northern California and losing everything.
It's just interesting because isn't the current trend at the moment to move southernly? People are wanting to, they're moving out of the Rust Belt to Texas and stuff. So I think it's interesting that, a lot of ones will move here and then maybe in 20 years they'll start to move back.
Yeah, I mean, well, there's always traffic in both directions. And it is interesting, the COVID migration, there was a tremendous migration that has had really, depending on whether you own property or not, really positive or negative ramifications across the country. For years, the United States had out-of-control real estate markets on the coasts. During COVID, a lot of people just moved away from the coasts and back into the middle of the country and created out-of-control real estate prices all over the country, like universally. In 2019, you could, and there's still some particularly blighted areas where you can go buy a $60,000 house, but in most of the United States, you could still buy a house for $250,000 in 2019. That is, vastly fewer places you can do that. And it's interesting thinking about that. Is some of that climate migration already? Is that already, because, to some extent, pandemics can be connected to climate, though, of course, the connection's a little less direct than others. But there's already large-scale migration happening in the United States all the time. Absolutely, tons of people are moving more people are moving to south than they're moving north, but it's always a flow. And I think Lustgarten is unnecessarily negative about the possibilities of that migration. I mean, to some extent, it's imaginable. It could be much worse than this, that sort of climate effects and just people not being willing to deal with heat waves just sort of lightly reverse the process that we've gone through over the past 50 years, where actually just more people move north than move south. And I think there's a tendency understandable tendency to describe that as like a catastrophic crash move. But, maybe Florida won't actually experience any kind of, panic loss. Maybe it'll just have the experience that, say, Cleveland had for the past 50 years. That Ohio had for the past 50 years of just sort of people leaching away. So, the thing is, we just don't know. We do not know.
Cynically, is it possible America is looking forward to climate change because it's seen that it's one of the regions that will do okay compared to, the likes of China and stuff that are, that's 1 billion plus America's population mouths to feed on a less fertile plain with exactly the same amount of land.
It's Bismarck again. God looks after fools, drunks in the United States. No matter what happens, it seems like we're in a good position. So we're very lucky. And honestly, this book kind of, I know it's the exact opposite of the intention of the writer, kind of left me a little more complacent. It's sort of like, if this is the scale of the problems we're really facing, I think the United States can handle them. That is not the way that I feel about much of the rest of the world.
Well, one thing is like one of his big fear things is like, the cost of electricity is going to be more expensive in the South. And you're like, you're talking about the year 2099. Like, who knows what's going to be powering electricity? It could be too cheap to meter. Like, there's so many breakthroughs that could have happened by then.
Well, one of the really screwed up things about Arizona, which is I've read it easily 5 or 6, and I read a lot of dystopian fiction, but I think I've read 5 or 6 separate pieces of science fiction that are like, Arizona dries up, Arizona's definitely drying up, Arizona is refugees from Arizona. And the main dynamic with green energy is that Arizona is the place where you can actually run heavy industry off of solar. So actually, Arizona might profit massively from the greening of industry. Arizona agriculture is doomed, but agricultural industry, Arizona industry, may be about to boom.
But it's also you're now able to get solar electricity at night, which sounds mad. They basically make molten metal from the solar during the day, and then you're able to run that during the night and get power. So the advancements that are going to happen by the end of the century are just going to be outstanding.
Yeah, I mean, and batteries are changing everything.
Just obviously it'd be nice if America was a bit more, more focused on it, but obviously Joe Biden's done his best with the IRA, so hopefully that should save America and possibly the world.
I think Abrahm Lustgarten is doing God's work here with this book, trying to get people scared. It's a good book to read. It's a good book to read to get a sense of the challenges.
Trying to hit a middle America where it hurts, which is real estate prices.
Yes, exactly. But I got to say, the book made me more complacent.
You'll not be selling your house?
No, well, certainly not in Michigan. I mean, he's actually making me think I should buy more houses in Michigan.
That seems to be basic. Yeah, that is the takeaway. Buy lots of land in Michigan. Maybe Milwaukee. So good news for America, probably bad news for everyone else.
Yeah, that's never happened before.
Yes, never has our podcast ever settled on that.
Yeah, all right. Wow.
So let's hope the world gets its act together and things aren't as bad, so we don't have to see a bunch of smug Americans.
Yeah, there you go. We don't need more of that. Yeah.
Hopefully we didn't get you too down. And if you're worried, just head north. That seems to be the gist.
Indeed.
We'll catch you next time. Ciao, ciao.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.